relatively short.
I have a question. Can you make that concatenate to the old file?
Probably not within the tool itself, because you cannot just append to a flash file. I think you have to change the index. Something has to change in the header portion.
I think you can append to it, but the tool has to support it.
Yeah. Well, I have tools that can do it, but it's easier just to upload two.
Since flash files are meant to be streamed.
Right. But I think the first portion of it may contain the overall length of the entire thing.
File header.
The index itself.
Yeah. All right. Well, I just broke it again. So even though it was working earlier, I was so excited. Now it doesn't work anymore. So something is. I think there's some settings, either in a file itself, or somewhere else, that is causing the issue. Since we don't have a whole lot of time left, I'm just going to do one thing, which is to start a new project and see if it has to do with something that is persistent in the workspace itself. So we'll have test menu 2. I don't even bother with the rest. I just have to specify a newer version of Linux, and I'll start with ice cream sandwich just to be sure. And we'll click.
Is it possible to do some of the stuff in lab time? Some of the stuff you're going to show, is it possible to do in lab time?
Sure.
Okay. Because I didn't really want to drive to school for a survey.
Well, that's what they need me to do. I'm the lucky one because I actually have 2 classes that are being surveyed, where most people only have 1. They picked about 7 courses out of the entire BCS division. I have 2 of those. Yeah, it's the same problem. It just would not. The GUI interface doesn't work. But at least the other one works okay. And I think the order in category is not the priority. Okay, somebody asked me whether there's a priority. I don't think that's the priority. That really is just the ordering of the item. So you can basically have items in the XML file appearing out of order, but as long as your order in category is using a particular number, it will still sort it when it displays it. Now, if you have 2 items of the same number in order in category, I'm not sure how it will do it in that case. I think in that case it's just the ordering in the file itself to resolve it. All right. Okay. So we can go back to this part here. The split screen display, looks kind of neat, but in order to do that, you have two things to do. One is to add this particular attribute to the activity element itself to basically say that split action bar when narrow to specify as one of the UI options. That one is located not in main itself, but located in layout. You go to activity main.xml and go to the activity main.xml file, and that's where you will find that particular attribute. It's not specified at this point with this particular application. So to do that, you will have to add it, to add UI options as a part of the activity attribute itself. So that would go in, let's see here.
So is this for like multiple instances, or multiple programs running at the same time? Or?
Yeah, this one actually goes into the manifest file, so it's not even in the layout file. It's going into the manifest file, which is
At the very bottom.
right there.
Which is in the main file.
Yep, and this one also has an XML representation. So you can look at the XML representation. It goes into this part here. So you have to add this option inside the activity tag, which is right here. So you have to add it right here. go ahead and give it a try and see if it works. Okay. And that's one of the first thing to do is here. To support older version, add a metadata element as a child of each activity element that declares the same value for that. Well, when it says older versions, I think version 4 is not falling into the older versions part. All right. So let's save all the files. Start our virtual machine through this part here.
Looks like there's a manifest error.
Hmm? Oh.
Are you recording it?
Yep.
Oh, awesome.
Okay. Actually, it's missing.
I think they need an Android component to it.
Yep.
No?
See. There we go.
Not there.
Alright, so this one is starting up. But it's kind of weird because the first time I switched the version of Java, it worked okay, and then all the subsequent runs of it, basically does not work anymore.
It's just like one of the fluke that happened before.
Mm-hmm.
It just happened to be right when you updated or changed over Java.
Tonight or something, I'll download the experimental version of Eclipse 4.4 and see if it works from there.
Okay, start the Android application.
Have you seen anyone else report that issue?
Mm-mm. Nope. I looked for it and then couldn't find it.
Yeah, I see.
So now it's split because you can see, it's the first part is here, and then the second part is down there. Whereas, before, this dot 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 or the overflow area was also up here. So that worked. Well, the nice thing is, the documentation is all based on XML, so it's not, so this will always work. Okay, as long as you have a text editor, it will work. So the GUI tool, it's nice to have it working. I would much rather to have that working too, but if it's not working, you know what, it's okay. All right, the next topic is actually even more interesting. It's not really just affecting the look and feel of the application. It's also affecting the actual function of the application. Because up to now, we have the back button, which does not do the same thing as a navigation up button. For those of you who have been using Google Gmail, this is, I think the monitor kind of switches back to its old self. I have to do the auto setup again. It keeps forgetting it, which is kind of weird. Okay, so this button here, in Google Gmail, allows you to go from your specific account in Gmail back to the previous level. It is not the same as a back button. A back button is historical. In other words, it is based on time. Okay, you went to this screen, you went to this screen, you went to this screen, and then went to this screen, and it allows you to backtrack to a previous screen. This one is structural, which means it goes back to whatever hierarchical screen that belongs to the previous one. And the way you specify who is the previous screen is to use inside the application, once again inside the manifest file inside the application. With each activity, you can specify who is the parent activity, and you can then specify, in this case, the parent activity of this particular one is just my first app dot main activity. So that part seems to be fairly static because you're just basically saying, okay, who is my parent application, or who's my parent activity, and whenever that button is clicked within a certain context, it will bring you back up to the previous level. Are there any questions about that particular button? It is not functionally exactly the same as a back button, even though a lot of times your back button would serve the same purpose, because you get down to a certain screen or a certain activity. When you press the back button, it backtracks to the previous one, which typically is hierarchically also whatever is previous. On the other hand, if you have multiple screens that are basically quote unquote siblings, then the back button will go back to the previous sibling of the same level, whereas the up button will always bring you up to the previous screen. Is that working out okay? And one is also very static. The parent thing is a very static thing. It is specified inside the metadata of the manifest file, whereas the back button, on the other hand, is very dynamic because it just remembers which screen you came from. So here it also talks about how you can override the parent activity intent and actually use that to specify which screen to back up to. That's the other way to do it, and you can do that dynamically. It's not completely static anymore. All right, any questions about the back button? That's also a newer feature, in Android. The older versions of Android do not have that feature. This one here, adding an action view has to do with changing a button into a particular view. Like when you use a dictionary application, Webster Dictionary has this particular feel and look. I'm not sure whether it's actually using this feature or not. But basically what it allows you to do is to change the action bar into a view, allowing you to enter something as text. And to do that, you have to specify the class of the action view is going to be a particular widget. In this case, it's a search view. So this is how you can enable that particular feature, is to have the action item itself to also have an action view class associated with it, which is kind of a handy feature if you want to put it up there.
I think it's actually kind of important because most applications in Android now use that.
Right.
So if you develop an Android app and you want your user, like you want a user to be able to say, oh, I'm familiar with this interface. So I think you probably want to include something like that in your application if it requires it.
Yep, and once again, it's for the consistent look and feel across all the different types of Android applications, because users now tend to expect if I click the lookup button, it would give me a bar on the action bar to search for something.
Do you think it's going to change radically, like in the next few versions?
I think we are starting to see it, getting more stabilized. Between version 4 and 4.4.2, there's not really a whole lot of GUI changes, as far as I could see. So a lot of that could be infrastructure change, like the support of Bluetooth, 4.0, and some other things that they're adding. I think Google is also, or Android is also very good at documenting their changes. So between versions, they usually have a good documentation saying that we are adding this, we're changing that, we're deprecating this, and so on. So that's definitely helpful, because now you can actually compare versions and find out, okay, what is the trade-off if I don't want to support this older version? What am I losing? So in order to make use of this, you have to make changes to the initialization tool. So when you specify your own onCreate options menu, in addition to what we usually do, we also have to now associate the particular search item, which is a menu item itself. You also have to make it associate with a search view and attach those two. So the way to do it is to find the item first. Okay, the menu item itself is easy to find because you can use menu.findItem in order to locate the item itself. Once you find the item, you have to create a search view and associate, not to create, but you have to associate the search view with that particular item. So this way, the system framework would know when you click on the item, the search view will display. Is that making any sense? Because you have to make the association somehow, and this is how you do it.
Does it take up the whole screen when you tap on the search? I'm not familiar with your UI.
In the view, it takes up as much space as it is available. Yep. But it will take up the entire bar. So all of your other items that were displayed before, will kind of go away for the time being, until you're done with the search bar or the search view itself.
So it's like a view within a view.
It is a view on the action bar.
Okay.
Because the action bar normally does not give you any place to edit anything. It is really just buttons. You can click on a button and it actuates something. It goes into the menu item selected, handler, and then you can do all the processing over there. This one has an automatic association with the view that allows you to enter something. So when you're done with entering that something, then you can get control and actually do something about it. This particular call does not create the search view. The search view is already there, associated with this item. Configure the search info and add any event listeners. Okay, so you have to add your event listeners to the view itself, and you can do the same thing with the on-click, because any view has an on-click method. So in this case, you can do exactly the same thing using an anonymous class to associate the on-click of the view itself, or any one of the methods of the search view in order to do whatever you need it to do. On API 11 or higher, get the action view by calling get action view on the corresponding menu item. So the menu item itself already has a method to deal with getting the action view itself, which is kind of handy. It looks kind of hard-coded to me too, because now you can only associate an item with an action view. Are there any questions about this part?
So we're talking about like on the phone, when you get an Android phone, mine came with like a Google search bar.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Like when I click on it, it opens up another thing that looks like that, but the whole thing is actually a button. Feels like a button. Like when you click on it, and it goes and it directly asks you to search for stuff. Like
I think it's more like. Let me see whether Gmail has it too, because Gmail actually has an ability to search through your email. So I can actually just take a quick look now. Yeah, if you just look at email, it has a search button on it. When you click on that, it also shows you the view, so you can actually search items.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's within the application itself. But when you look at the home screen, the launcher. The launcher has a Google search thing, but I think that one works differently. It actually starts up, the Google application.
Okay. Yeah, mine has the search option when you go to the settings.
Yeah, we haven't talked about how to get widgets, to work, on the launcher.
Okay.
Yep. Because that one is basically a widget on the launcher
Yeah,
itself.
Yeah, that's what it feels like.
Yep. To preserve action bar space, you can collapse your action view into an action button. When collapsed, the system might place the action into the action overflow, which is the default behavior. Like the search button itself, it normally displays as an icon. It does not display the view itself. Because the system expands the action view when the user selects an action, you do not need to respond to the item. In the on options item selected callback, the system will still call it, but if you return true, then the action view will not expand. Okay. Do you guys know what this is really talking about? It's basically saying that if you have an action view associated with an action item, you don't want to do, let me just kind of scroll back to the code earlier about how to handle an action item. You don't want to handle it over here. Because when you return true to, on options item selected, it's basically saying, okay, it's done. Okay, I have done what the action item is supposed to do. But when you have an action view associated with an action item, you want to let the action view to do further processing. So you don't want to handle it here and say that I'm done. Okay, you don't want to return true. So what you want to do in this case is not to have this case at all. Get rid of case r.id.action search, assuming that is the name of your search icon. Do not specify that at all, and use the default to handle it. Because the default would basically pass it back to the system, and then the system framework already knows this action item has an action view associated with it, and it will do whatever is the right default behavior, which is to open up the action view, allow people to type something into it, and then when they press the enter key while inside the action view, that will trigger further action that you specify with the action view itself. Am I making any sense? Kind of? Not? Okay. Okay, when you look at the screen initially, okay, when you look at the action bar, you have a lookup button here. That is really just an icon at this point. So what do you do when you click this icon, when you press it? Well, when you first press it, it will trigger an options item selected event. So that means when you click this button here, it will get into this particular subroutine because it is an action item. Now, when you're in this particular subroutine, you can specify what do you want to do with that particular item when it is clicked. If you do it the way it is specified here on the projector, then what is going to happen is you will have to handle the full logic of dealing with what do you want to do when the search icon is pressed. So instead, what you want to do is to say, nope, I'm not going to do it this way. So you get rid of this part here. Okay, you get rid of this part, which means the switch statement will skip to the default part of the case statement, which means you're going to say, okay, superclass, do whatever you think is the right thing to do with this particular item. And in that case, because the manifest file has already identified this particular item has an action view associated with it, and the name of the class of that particular action view, the system would then automatically say, oh, okay, yeah, now I need to handle it, and I'll just go by my manifest file. So the next screen, or the next screen you will see, is basically an action view here with a button, to represent the search bar. And it will do it correctly. Now, what do you do when somebody is typing here? Okay, with each key event or whatever event is associated with the search view, you can use the event handlers corresponding to the search view to specify what you want to do with it. And all of that stuff has to be registered in the code that we were looking at a little bit earlier. So let me just switch back to that portion. Just bear with me here. Right here. Okay. So the first call is to inflate the menu, which is what you have to do anyway, is to load the menu into the framework. The second item is just to locate the search item itself. The third line uses the search item in order to locate the search view, and is casting it at runtime into a search view, which is a subclass of a particular view. As a search view, now you can specify how to deal with the event handlers of a search view. Let's take a really quick look at what you can do with a search view, because that's a fairly common action view in Android. And we want to focus on the event handlers of this particular one, so they're all basically on something. All right, so you can basically have event handlers to deal with on action view collapsed. Basically, it is no longer displayed. It is now a single icon again. On action view expanded, somebody just clicked on the search icon and expanded. So at those times, you actually have control over something. You can actually trigger your own logic to execute. On key down is useful too, because as somebody is typing something on the search view, you can now actually start to respond to it by giving people a suggested list, so they can actually click on something like, okay, you have searched for these things already in the past. Do you want to research for one of these items? Onkeydown, it's just what we talked about. On window, focus changed. Called when window containing this view gains or loses focus, which can be useful because if somebody is typing something here and then suddenly click on somewhere else on the screen, now you can respond to it. Do you want to close this, or what else do you want to do? That is up to you to decide. So it does give you a lot of hooks in terms of what your application can do while somebody is interacting with your search view. Are there any questions about this part? No questions? Do you think that you will write an application where you actually have a use of a search view?
Yes.
Okay, so depending on your application, right? Go ahead.
How do you specify the logic of the if you should have certain results that from a string that the user put it, you can actually specify the logic and how it shows up, or is it all system?
That is up to your application to decide.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So you can display a partial list of all the items that matches the string up to this point. So that's all application dependent, because you cannot have a universal search bar that works across all the applications.
Oh, gotcha.
Right, because if you have an email program, then you might be searching for a sender's name, or search by title of the email, search by body of the email. But when you have a different applications, let's say let's say a recipe, recipe application, you can search by ingredients, you can search by types of food or region of food, and so on and so forth. So that way, when you type, and do a partial match, with whatever is available, then people can just click on one of the partial match and say, okay, this is what I want. By just typing 3 letters, you can find out exactly what that person wants to do. Okay. Any questions about the search view? Let me just do one more thing here. Search view example or tutorial. So you can definitely just go for create a search interface with this is Android tutorial, and it kind of guides you through the entire process. So this will basically tell you how to do the display the partial list and so on. So getting back to where we were over here. So we were just here a little bit earlier. Action provider is kind of like an action view, except after you display an action provider, then it is entirely up to your code to decide what to do after that. So you kind of have a lot more to specify, but you also get the flexibility of that. An action provider replaces the action button with a customized layout. In other words, when you click on this icon here, this particular icon inside the gallery, when you click this, it will display this portion here. However, unlike an action view, an action provider takes control of all of the action's behaviors. An action provider can display a submenu when pressed. And then this one is also the same thing as what we have seen before, because each action provider, instead of action view, class defines its own action behavior. You don't need to listen for the action in the and on options item selected method. If necessary, you can still listen for the click event in here in case you need to simultaneously perform another action. But once again, the most important part is to return a value of false, because otherwise the framework will think that, okay, I'm done handling this particular item, menu item selected event, and it will just close everything because it thinks it's all done already. this part here is also important. If you provide a submenu of actions, your activity does not receive a call to on options item selected when the user opens the list or select one of the menu items. In other words, you will have to use the submenu itself and specify a on whatever event handler inside the submenu item object and not in the main activity class itself. All right. Are there any questions about this part? Questions? I think I'm going to stop the lecture at this point for today. A lot of this stuff, there's a lot of things you can do with the action bar. I don't think, we're going to have to, implement every single one of these, because otherwise we won't have enough time for other things. But if you find one that you particularly want to, experiment with, this is not a bad documentation to get started with, because with this one you can always look up the correct name of the class and then go to the class documentation itself and find out more about how to actually get it done. Any questions about the action bar? Well, do you think it's an important part of an application? Think about the app.
Yeah.
It is. Yep. It is actually a very important part because it's it's the system framework providing you with an ability to easily select what the user wants to do at any particular time of running an application. So it is a very useful feature, because instead of having your own buttons on your screen to trigger operations, you can now use the action bar or action menu and action items in order to start up certain types of actions. And the best part of this has to do with most users already expect and know how to operate using the system provided menu. So instead of using your own button and your own way to trigger operations, which is specific to your application, using this means that your application will also be upward compatible. As long as you redistribute the application using the SDK of a newer version, then you can inherit the feel and look of the next version of Android. If Android 5.0 comes out and this part looks different, as long as you still play by the same rules, your application will still look up to date. Yep.
How will it display if you wish to have the app put into full screen mode in certain parts?
I see what you mean. So kind of like the browser.
Yeah.
How will it display? You mean the action bar itself?
Yeah. Will it?
You can
tap on it, then it'll display for a second, or it just sort of hidden and you have to hit it?
I think that's under your control now.
Oh, okay.
Because the action bar itself has a method to hide itself. So that means in your application, you can choose what logic to use to hide it and how to make it unhide itself. For instance, you can use the accelerometer to make it appear again. So you can basically tap your phone or just flick it twice and capture that motion and then say, okay, now I want to display the action bar for the next 2 seconds. 2 seconds comes up, nothing happens, you can auto hide it. But that is entirely up to your application. In the case of the built-in browser, at least with KitKat, when you scroll it, the action bar appears, but when you stop scrolling or actually doing anything, touching the screen for a second or so, then the action bar goes away and you go back into the full screen mode. It may not be a bad idea to look at action bar class. So instead of using the guide, which is what we have been reading, if you go to try to look for the class definition, not the I guess the class definition will be here. Now inside each design guide, it has key classes, which basically says, okay, what are the major classes that are related to this particular article, and in here action bar is the class that we want to get to. So when you look at action bar, you can look at all the methods, and I'm pretty sure hide is one of them. There we go. hide the action bar if it's currently showing, so you have the ability to hide the action bar. Right. Is that helping? Now it is abstract and public, so that means you will have to implement it. There's no base definition of the hide. Hide the action bar if it's currently shown. If the Windows hosting the action bar does not have the feature, it will resize the application content to fill the new space available. Instead of calling this method directly, you can also cause an action bar using the overlay feature to hide through view.system.ui flag full screen. Hiding the action bar through the system UI flag allows you to more seamlessly hide it in conjunction with other screen declarations. So instead of just hiding it, you can make your application go full screen, which means the activity itself is covering the space that normally would be used to show the action bar.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So I think I'm going to stop the lecture at this point. How is your H2O program coming along? We have one more week to go. Go ahead.
Just
Not going.
answering your question.
Okay. Do I hear some grinding noise?
What you hear is the sound of my soul.
What, is there an obstacle of some kind, or do you guys want me to do something? Yep.
Can we just do a quick review about how to keep track of how to change state?
How to change a state?
Yeah, how we change the state? When we do this game, how are we keeping track of, say, paper, rock, and scissors? Maybe go back over that.
Okay, the paper, rock, scissors one is actually in a way slightly more complicated than the H2O one. Okay, but when we go back to rock, paper, scissors, which is here. Inside source, we have several files. We have tons of files in this case, but it is under RPS model that we implement all the logic related to the model itself. And in here, you can see that I have one variable called state to explicitly keep track of the state machine. Now, to do the transition, you have to have, okay, there are several calls that will serve as trigger points to cause a state change. So each trigger point is basically a method that is exposed to an adapter so that your view can go through an adapter to access that particular method. And that particular method will eventually basically cause something to happen within the state machine. In this particular case, user choose is one of those methods. In other words, whenever I choose a particular choice on in the activity, it will go through the adapter, and then the adapter in return will call user choose as a method. And this will trigger a particular state change. The first thing I do is to do the assertion, but the assertion does not work, at least not the way that by default. But based on the choice, I can look at the current choice of the application, look at the user choice, and then I can decide what is the next state in the state machine. So this is how the state is tracked and also changed inside the model. But only the model needs to know it. Okay, nobody else should have to know it, with the exception of when you do make a change of state, you want to notify the listener adapter about the state change. In other words, whoever is interested in the change of state will now be able to, okay, it's just this part here. You can notify whoever is interested that, yep, I just changed my state, so that whoever is listening can now decide, okay, is this important to me? Should I display something differently on screen, and so on and so forth. The most important part is we're separating the view, which is what it looks like, from the model, which is how what is the logic of running this particular application. And in between, we have adapters. So the view doesn't call anything in the model directly. The model does not call the view directly. And that interchange, the layer in between the adapter allows you to make the application more complicated later on by saying that, okay, instead of just having the screen or the activity as a listener to respond to changes of the state change, I can also have a remote server to remember, who played which game and how many times it has won, that person has won, and so on and so forth, by just changing the adapter without changing anything else in the application. Yep.
In the counter program, so I'm pretty sure I understand in your whole model package and the whole view package. Can you kind of verbally go through and pull the counter program up and show me what the adapters are doing?
The adapters?
And explain it.
The adapters in general are basically a mechanism to connect between the model and the view.
I understand that, but I don't get how it's working.
But that part has nothing, it's the same way as the rock, paper, scissors example. This one I just use additional packages to kind of group things together, which is not needed in your homework assignment. So you probably don't want to do it with extra packages, because with the extra packages, you need extra imports in order for those packages to become visible to each other.
But that's not the part I'm not understanding. I'm just not understanding how it's working.
How is it working?
Yeah, the interface, or the adapters. What's actually going on?
The
I don't know if the model
adapters.
is having this issue or not.
Do you want to use the counter as an example, or rock, paper, scissors?
Counter. So that's what I've been looking at.
Okay. So which one do you want me to look at first?
Can you go into the main activity and just, so let's start with adapter equals new basic adapter.
Okay.
Can you kind of verbally tell me what's happening?
Well, then you have to go to basic adapter and find out what that class is really doing. So this is basic adapter. Basic adapter implements iAdapter, which defines what type of methods it has to implement. And each one basically is a relay to a model or a view. In this case, it's a fairly simple one because it is a relay to exactly one view and also exactly one model. In other words, you cannot have multiple views associated with a single model. But that means, if you want to change that, you just have to change the basic adapter to a complex adapter that can accommodate multiple views for a single model. But basically, this is how you can track things down. Is once you track down, basic adapter has a internal variable view, which is of the type interface counter view, and has a model which is of the type interface counter model. Then you can look at those two definitions, which is iCounter model and also iCounter view, which is up here, and to find out how each one works. Main activity implements iCounter view. Counter implements iCounter model. So those are basically the underlying implementation of those interfaces. So you look into counter and find out what counter does. You can look under main activity and find out what it does. But because main activity implements iCounter view, whatever iCounter view specifies, it has to implement. In this case, it only has to implement one particular method, which is update count. Is that? Did I answer your question? I mean.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because if you look at this one and you look at rock, paper, scissors and see what is common between those two examples, then you should start to see a picture of what adapters are really doing. They're basically the intermediate class that is connecting between the view or possibly multiple views to a model. Yep.
Is there like a type of input and display you wish to have, or would you recommend to have for this H2O model?
With the H2O model, you need the view to provide you the triggers to cause the model to transition. So in this case, it's one single one, which is temperature change. And whichever way you want to implement temperature change is okay with me. You can use a slider. You can use a text box just to have someone to type in the new temperature. You can also have two buttons, increment and decrement, just change the temperature 1 degree at a time. So you can do whatever you want. You can make it really fancy using a dial. So you can do a dial thing. Yep.
That reminds me. Did you figure out what was going on with the cert?
No, not yet. Not yet. I think with the assert, it's probably a system setting, or inside Eclipse, the tool itself is basically configuring assert not to do anything, because it does tax runtime. If you turn on assertion, every time it runs the assert statement, it's going to tax. It's going to actually evaluate the condition. So for production purposes, you probably want to turn it off, because you don't want it to tax any additional time.
Better off using like a try catch.
Try catch, you basically give yourself more control with a try catch, because now you can control. It's actually try catch on one side and then a throw on the other side. It gives you more control because now you can decide what you want to do. In fact, you can have one of your menus to configure a particular setting to say, okay, do I want to throw when there's an exception? Okay, you can basically say no, I do not want to throw because it's in production. So the default value is off, but when you're testing, you can turn that on.
How does Android/Java work with illegal operations?
What do you mean by illegal operations?
Like you're dividing by 0 or something like that. What would the system do? Or will it just like contain the error, or just dump out saying, this program has crashed?
It throws an exception. Now, whether the exception causes something to be displayed on screen, that part I do not know. It's easy to test. I mean, you just have to have one button that will trigger a division by 0 and then see what happens.
I just want to see how it would go. It would reach that. Would it just throw a exception, allow you to continue on?
It throws an
filling in the
exception for
value?
sure, which means if you know exactly what exception can happen, you can actually have a try catch block to catch it so that your it doesn't throw all the way out of the application and terminates the application itself. So if you know that you are expecting these exceptions to happen just because somebody can enter invalid data, well, first of all, you can validate the data first, okay? But failing that, you can always have a try catch block within your own application to catch that particular exception and decide what to do next.
Okay, so the standard approach, the standard reaction would dump you out of the application after notifying.
Correct, because any uncaught exception is thrown all the way up to the top level of the application, which terminates the application, and you just basically have the application force closed in that case.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
Going back to the homework assignment.
Yep.
Can we assume an initial state, like a certain temperature, like say 40 degrees or?
Frozen?
It's a good question. Sorry?
Initial state, 0 degrees Celsius. Until you have a value.
That's a good question. What would be the initial temperature, right?
Yeah.
You can have your application to specify that if you want to. If not, you can always specify, the standard condition. And I cannot remember in the standard condition what is the temperature. It's 1 ATM, and the temperature is it 19, 20 degrees Celsius or so? Okay. I can look it up.
Yeah, it's right here.
Okay, standard condition for temperature and pressure is 25 degrees Celsius at 1 ATM. You can kind of assume the 1 ATM part because if you change pressure, a lot of other things will change too. The boiling point will change, your freezing point will change.
ATM?
So you can assume 1 ATM, one atmospheric pressure.
Okay. I couldn't figure out what the T was.
Oh, okay. It's just atmospheric. Yep. So in this case, it's a scientific kind of thing. When you say standard condition, quote unquote standard condition in the chemistry class, it automatically assumes both the temperature, which is 1 atm. Okay, standard ambient temperature is 25 degrees, and the absolute pressure of basically one. Well, actually, that's interesting. It's not 1 atm. It is 0.987 atm.
1 bar. 1 bar.
1 bar.
But this is all related to on Earth.
Correct. Yep. Okay, that was a good question. So I would say initialize it to 20 degrees, 25 degrees, whichever one you want to use is fine.
Or just
Just
like-
give it a initial condition.
Dash, not set.
Well, if it's not set, you don't know what state you're in. That's the problem.
Because if if you don't set it, then you're not giving it what the temperature is, which would not give a value. You want to say, oh, you're in water before I even say what the temperature of that the H2O is. You're gonna say no, unavailable until you give it a parameter.
To trigger the initialize.
Yeah.
Yep. So you guys can choose what to do. The simplest way is simply to give it a particular initial temperature. But if you want to make the initialize call explicit by having a button to trigger the initialize, that would be fine as well. So that way you can actually set an initial temperature and then click initialize, and that will cause the transition from the initial state of the state machine to whatever state it really needs to go in initially.
Oh, and I see on here that temperature change is temperature less than or equal to 0. What about sub-zero? At like absolute 0. How?
That's in degrees Celsius.
Yeah. So 0 degrees Celsius is absolute 0.
No, absolute 0 is negative 273 degrees Celsius.
Okay, then I'm just looking at what your chart says right here, and it says the transition from water to ice is the temperature is less than. Sorry, I was misreading it or misinterpreting it.
That's okay.
Greater
I'm taking
than
a
or-
quick look here.
Greater than 0.
Yeah, those are all in degrees Celsius. Because you cannot go below absolute 0. Absolute 0 means all vibration stops. Yep. So you cannot go below that.
Can't go below that because you wouldn't be able to measure it. Well, you'd be frozen if you go below.
Right. Well, once you, because temperature is how violently your molecules are vibrating. So when it stops vibrating, there's no colder temperature to mention because it really is absolute 0. Is that making any sense?
Mm-hmm.
What is the freezing temperature of hydrogen?
Hydrogen.
It gets pretty close, but not quite absolute 0. So freezing
Probably
temperature,
like
freezing
243
point
Kelvin.
of H2, not H2O. It's about 13 degrees away from absolute 0, which is pretty close. Usually, the lighter the gas, the lower the the freezing point, and also the lower the
Have they
condensing
actually
point.
gotten to that far, or is it theoretical? That would be the question.
That I do not know. Okay, to exist as a liquid, H2 hydrogen must be cooled below hydrogen's critical point of 33 degrees Kelvin for hydrogen to be a full liquid state without evaporating at atmospheric pressure, it needs to be cooled to 20 Kelvin. So that's already pretty close to its own freezing point, which is only 13 Kelvin. In other words, this is one molecule that does not like to exist in liquid state. Unlike a bromine, which is easy to turn into liquid state. All right. Any other questions? This would be a good article to read to find out why hydrogen powered vehicles may not be a very good idea.
Aside from explosive capabilities.
If you think gasoline is explosive, it's nothing compared to hydrogen gas. That's why diesel actually is a decent fairly safe fuel, because diesel does not explode. Well, not under normal circumstances. It's very viscous.
But Europe if you think about diesel, just 10 years ago, it was the dirtiest kind of vehicles out there. But in Europe, they invested in fixing it and getting it better. Right now, it's really clean and it's 60 miles a gallon.
They have an interesting technology to make a diesel exhaust, clean. I think I can stop the recording now. With Mercedes, they call it Blue Tech, and what they do is they put urea, which is a chemical, into the exhaust stream, and it reacts with the exhaust of diesel, the particulate matter, and it just crystallizes, everything. So there's nothing emitted, that is released into the atmosphere. It becomes, little particles that are crystalline, and and that's how they deal with it.
And then it goes
So,
into the storm drain.
sorry?
And then it goes into the storm drain.
I'm not sure whether it's actually soluble or not, or is it more like sand and it just kind of stays locked up, forever. But you do need chemicals, to get. You have to replenish the material, like every 10,000 miles or so. You have to go into a Mercedes dealership, and they will basically quote unquote recharge, that chemical, to make sure that you can continue to operate the engine at a clean state. Yep.
Relating to his question, scientists have achieved temperatures extremely close to absolute zero, where matter exhibits quantum effects such as superconductivity and fluidity.
Yeah, absolute zero or low temperature is closely related to superconduction, because what is limiting? Why do you think a tungsten light bulb lights up? Why does it even light up? It's resistance, right? Resistance creates heat because power dissipation is related to VI, and the V is basically the voltage drop across 2 points. And if you have no resistance, there's no voltage drop, and therefore no power loss. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no questions, I'm going to stop the recorder.